Have you ever wondered what lies behind the marble walls of the most secretive place on earth? What if I told you that beneath the Vatican's sacred halls there exists a labyrinth of hidden chambers containing documents so explosive that they could rewrite history itself? Tonight, we're going deep into the shadows of the Holy See, guided by someone who has walked those forbidden corridors. My name is Father Marcus, though that title no longer defines me. For 17 years, I served within the Vatican's inner circles. I cleaned the papal apartments, delivered confidential correspondence, and yes, I had access to places most will never see. But what I discovered in those silent halls changed everything I believed about faith, power, and truth. This isn't another conspiracy theory. This isn't sensationalized fiction. This is the raw, unfiltered account of what really happens when the cameras stop rolling and the crowds go home. Because behind every blessing, every prayer, every public ceremony, there's another story. A story written in whispers, sealed with wax, and buried so deep that even the earth above seems to forget it exists. You see, the Vatican isn't just a religious institution. It's a sovereign state, a political entity, and perhaps most importantly, it's the keeper of humanity's most carefully guarded secrets. For over 2 millennia, every letter, every negotiation, every crisis has been meticulously documented and preserved. But preserved for whom? And why do only a select few ever get to read these chronicles of power? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the Apostolic Secret Archives, now known as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. 85 kilometers of shelving, over 35,000 catalogued entries, documents spanning from the 8th century to the present day. That's more historical material than most nations possess, all controlled by an institution smaller than a city block. But here's what they don't tell you in the tourist brochures. Less than 5% of these archives are accessible to scholars. The rest remain locked away, classified under levels of secrecy that would make intelligence agencies envious. And I should know, because I've seen the filing systems. I've held documents marked with stamps that don't appear in any official Vatican handbook. The question isn't whether the Vatican has secrets. The question is why those secrets are considered too dangerous for the world to know. What could be so explosive, so earth-shattering, that an institution built on truth feels compelled to hide it in perpetuity? Let me paint you a picture of what it's really like inside those walls. Imagine walking through corridors where every footstep echoes with 8 centuries of hidden history, where filing cabinets contain correspondence between popes and emperors, between cardinals and kings, between the Holy See and powers you never knew existed, where some rooms require 3 separate keys, held by 3 different officials, just to ensure no single person can access what lies within. I remember the first time I was granted access to the restricted sections. The air itself felt different, heavier, as if the weight of all those buried truths was pressing down from above. There were documents in languages I couldn't identify, sealed with wax that bore symbols I'd never seen in any theological textbook. And there were gaps, deliberate, calculated gaps, where you could see that pages had been removed, entire sections excised with surgical precision. The Vatican operates under something called pontifical secrecy. It sounds official, almost bureaucratic. But in practice, it means that certain information is considered so sensitive that even acknowledging its existence could result in automatic excommunication. Not just for revealing the secrets, but for admitting you know they exist. Think about that for a moment. An institution that preaches transparency and truth has created a classification system so restrictive that even confirming you've seen certain documents is grounds for spiritual exile. What kind of information requires that level of protection? During my years of service, I encountered filing systems that defied logic. Documents were organized not by date or subject, but by levels of sensitivity that seem to follow no earthly hierarchy. Some 20th century correspondence was buried deeper than medieval manuscripts. Some letters from minor bishops were classified higher than communications with world leaders. And then there were the special collections. Files marked with codes that didn't appear in any official catalogue. Boxes that arrived in the dead of night, delivered by individuals who spoke in languages I couldn't place. Material that was immediately transferred to sections I was explicitly forbidden from entering, even as a custodial staff member. The Vatican's relationship with historical truth is complicated, to say the least. On one hand, they've preserved documents that might otherwise have been lost to time. Letters from Galileo, correspondence between medieval popes and Eastern emperors, diplomatic exchanges that shaped the course of nations. These archives contain some of humanity's most precious historical treasures, but preservation and accessibility are two very different things. Just because something has been saved doesn't mean it will ever see the light of day, and the criteria for what gets revealed and what remains hidden follows patterns that have nothing to do with historical significance and everything to do with institutional protection. I've seen correspondence between Vatican officials and intelligence agencies from multiple countries. Not historical documents, but recent exchanges. The Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with nearly every nation on earth, but what those relationships actually entail goes far beyond the ceremonial meetings you see on television. There are financial records that would astound you. Not just the Vatican bank scandals that occasionally make headlines, but investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and monetary flows that span continents. The Vatican isn't just spiritually wealthy, it's financially connected to institutions and individuals in ways that would surprise even the most cynical observers. And then there are the records that deal with internal church matters, disciplinary actions, investigation reports, correspondence about problems that never make it to public attention. The Vatican has its own legal system, its own courts, its own methods of handling situations that would be front-page news if they occurred anywhere else. But perhaps most intriguing are the documents that don't fit into any clear category. Reports from missionaries in remote locations describing encounters that challenge conventional understanding. Scientific observations made by Vatican astronomers that contradict official positions. Correspondence with religious leaders from traditions that supposedly have no formal relationship with Rome. The Vatican Observatory, for instance, has been conducting astronomical research for centuries, but not all of their observations make it into published papers. There are files containing star charts, planetary observations, and cosmic phenomena that remain classified for reasons no one has adequately explained. What do Vatican astronomers see in the heavens that requires such secrecy? During my tenure, I encountered documents written in cipher. Not ancient codes, but modern encryption methods applied to correspondence that should have been routine administrative material. Why does a religious institution need to encrypt communications about seemingly mundane matters? What are they discussing that requires such elaborate security measures? The answer, I believe, lies in understanding that the Vatican operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the public face, the spiritual institution that millions see and trust. There's the diplomatic entity conducting international relations with the sophistication of any major power. And then there's something else, something deeper, a level of operation that exists in the spaces between official acknowledgement and outright denial. I've seen evidence of the Vatican's involvement in events that supposedly had nothing to do with religious matters. Political transitions, economic developments, social movements that appeared to be purely secular, but had Vatican fingerprints all over the supporting documentation. The Holy See doesn't just respond to world events. In many cases, it helps shape them. The most chilling aspect of my experience wasn't discovering that the Vatican has secrets. It was realizing how systematically those secrets are managed. There's an entire infrastructure dedicated to controlling information flow. Specialists whose job is to determine what can be revealed, when, and to whom. procedures for handling requests that ensure certain topics never even get proper consideration. And there's the human element. The people who work within this system, who've devoted their lives to serving an institution that requires them to carry knowledge they can never share. The psychological toll of maintaining that level of secrecy affects everyone from the highest-ranking cardinals to the most junior staff members. I remember conversations that stopped mid-sentence when certain topics arose. Colleagues who would suddenly change the subject if discussions ventured into sensitive territory. An entire culture of calculated silence that permeates every level of Vatican operations. It's not paranoia. It's institutional conditioning that runs so deep it becomes second nature. The Vatican's approach to historical disclosure follows a pattern that reveals their true priorities. Documents that make the Church look good get expedited release. Material that might raise uncomfortable questions gets indefinitely delayed, and information that could fundamentally challenge established narratives simply disappears into classifications so restrictive that future researchers may never know it existed. But here's what really troubles me. The Vatican doesn't just control its own secrets, it influences how other institutions handle Vatican-related information. Through diplomatic channels, academic relationships, and financial connections, the Holy See has managed to create a global network of discretion that extends far beyond its own walls. Universities with Vatican connections self-censor their research. Museums with Catholic funding avoid controversial exhibitions. Publishers with church ties reject manuscripts that might prove embarrassing. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It's a web of influence so subtle and pervasive that most people involved don't even realize they're part of it. The question that haunted me during my final years of service was simple. If the Vatican truly represents divine truth, why does it need such elaborate mechanisms for hiding information? What are they protecting? And more importantly, what are they protecting it from? Tonight, we're going to explore these questions together. We'll examine specific cases where Vatican secrecy has shaped historical understanding. We'll look at documents that challenge official narratives, and we'll investigate the systems that keep certain truths buried while allowing others to see the light. This isn't about attacking faith or undermining belief. It's about understanding power, how it operates, how it protects itself, and how it shapes the reality that billions of people accept as truth. Because in the end, the Vatican's greatest secret isn't any single document or hidden archive. The Vatican's greatest secret is the simple fact that there are secrets at all. The first secret I need to share with you involves something that happened in 1981. Something that shook the Vatican to its core, yet the full truth has never been publicly acknowledged. I'm talking about the Emanuela Orlandi case, and what I discovered about it will change how you see everything. Emanuela was 15 years old when she disappeared. A Vatican citizen, daughter of a Vatican employee, she simply vanished one afternoon after leaving music lessons. The official story speaks of investigations, theories, possible connections to international conspiracies, but what they don't tell you is what I found buried in the restricted files. There were internal memos, dated just days after her disappearance, that revealed the Vatican knew far more than they ever admitted. Communications between high-ranking officials discussing containment protocols and information management strategies. These weren't documents about finding a missing girl. These were damage control procedures implemented before the public even knew she was gone. I held those papers in my hands, felt the weight of institutional cover-up pressed into the very fibers of the parchment, and I realized that Emanuela's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of something much deeper. A system so committed to protecting its image that even the fate of a child became secondary to preserving secrets. But Emanuela's case is just one thread in a tapestry of concealment that stretches back centuries. Let me tell you about the Knights Templar files, because what the Vatican has hidden about them will astound you. For 700 years, the world believed that Pope Clement V had condemned the Templars, agreeing to their destruction at the hands of King Philip IV of France. Every history book, every documentary, every scholarly work repeated this narrative. The Church had betrayed the warrior monks who had served it faithfully during the Crusades, except that's not what actually happened. In 2001, an Italian scholar named Barbara Frall discovered something extraordinary in the Vatican secret archives. Hidden away, misfiled, and forgotten was a document called the Chinon Parchment. This wasn't just any document. It was Pope Clement V's secret absolution of the Templars, written in his own hand, declaring them innocent of the charges brought against them. For 7 centuries, the Vatican allowed the world to believe they had condemned the Templars. They let this narrative persist, knowing it was false because the truth was more complicated. The truth revealed papal weakness, political manipulation, and the Church's inability to protect those who served it. So they buried it, filed it away where no one would think to look, and let history write itself around a lie. But here's what really chills me about this discovery. When the document was finally revealed, the Vatican's response wasn't celebration of historical truth. It was carefully managed damage control. They acknowledged the finding, but downplayed its significance. They allowed limited scholarly access, but restricted broader examination. Even when caught in a 700-year deception, their instinct was still to control the narrative. This pattern repeats throughout Vatican history. Truth gets buried not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. And the mechanisms for this burial are so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in Vatican operations, that they function automatically. Take the Galileo case. Everyone knows the basic story. The Church condemned the astronomer for supporting heliocentric theory, forced him to recant, kept him under house arrest. It's presented as a historical lesson about the conflict between faith and science. But what most people don't know is that the Vatican has never released the complete trial records. What exists in the public domain is carefully curated. Selected documents that support the narrative of eventual papal acknowledgement of error, of the Church's evolution toward accepting scientific truth. But there are files, sealed files, that contain the complete correspondence between Galileo and Church officials. Letters that reveal the political calculations behind the condemnation, the personal rivalries that influenced the decision, the economic factors that made Galileo's ideas threatening to established power structures. I've seen the catalogue entries for these documents. They exist, they're preserved, but they remain classified under pontifical secrecy, accessible only to a handful of Vatican-approved scholars who must agree to strict limitations on what they can publish. Why? What could 17th century correspondence possibly contain that still requires such protection? The answer lies in understanding that the Vatican doesn't just preserve history, it curates it. They decide which version of events becomes accepted truth and which remains hidden in darkness. During my years inside those walls, I encountered this curation process firsthand. I witnessed meetings where officials discussed not just what to preserve, but how to present it. Conversations about contextual frameworks and interpretive guidelines that would shape how future researchers understood historical events. There's an entire department, never officially acknowledged, whose job is historical narrative management. They don't falsify documents, but they control access, influence interpretation, and ensure that inconvenient truths remain buried under layers of bureaucratic obstruction. I remember one particular incident that opened my eyes to how this system really works. A historian had requested access to correspondence between Pope Pius XII and German bishops during World War II. Standard procedure, reasonable academic inquiry, the kind of research that should be routine for an institution committed to historical transparency. But instead of simple approval or denial, I watched as this request triggered a complex evaluation process. Committees were formed. Background checks were conducted not just on the researcher, but on their academic advisors, their funding sources, their publication history. The request wasn't being evaluated based on scholarly merit. It was being assessed for potential damage to Vatican reputation. Eventually, the historian was granted limited access to carefully selected documents. Material that had been pre-screened, contextually framed, and strategically chosen to support existing Vatican narratives about the wartime papacy. The researcher left believing they had conducted thorough investigation, never knowing that the most significant documents had been withheld entirely. This is how institutional truth gets manufactured, not through outright lies, but through selective revelation. By controlling what people can see, you control what they believe. And the Vatican has perfected this process over centuries of practice. The financial records are perhaps the most heavily guarded secrets of all. Not just the Vatican bank scandals that occasionally surface in media reports, but the complete picture of Vatican wealth and its global connections. I've seen investment portfolios that would astound you. Real estate holdings spanning continents, financial relationships with institutions and individuals that would fundamentally change how people understand the Church's role in global economics. The Vatican isn't just wealthy, it's strategically positioned within international financial networks in ways that give it influence far beyond what its size would suggest. They hold shares in companies you interact with daily. They have investment relationships with governments you wouldn't expect. They participate in economic decisions that affect millions of lives, all while maintaining the public image of spiritual detachment from worldly concerns. But the financial secrecy serves a purpose beyond mere wealth protection. Money flows create paper trails, and paper trails reveal relationships. If the complete picture of Vatican finances became public, it would expose connections that would embarrass not just the Church, but powerful individuals and institutions around the world. I once handled correspondence related to a real estate transaction in London, routine property management, or so it seemed. But as I processed the paperwork, I realized this wasn't just about buying or selling buildings. The transaction was structured in a way that provided financial benefits to specific political figures while giving the Vatican strategic influence in British economic development. Nothing illegal, nothing that violated any written rules, but everything designed to create mutual dependence between Vatican interests and secular power structures. And this was just one transaction among thousands, each carefully crafted to build networks of influence that operate completely outside public scrutiny. The Vatican's diplomatic relationships function similarly. On the surface, they maintain formal ties with nearly every nation on Earth. Ceremonial meetings, cultural exchanges, humanitarian cooperation. But beneath, this public diplomacy runs a parallel network of information sharing, strategic coordination, and mutual assistance that would shock anyone who believes in the separation of church and state. I processed communications between Vatican officials and intelligence agencies from multiple countries. Not historical documents, but recent exchanges. Information sharing agreements that allowed the Church to access intelligence reports while providing foreign governments with Vatican insights into global religious movements, political developments in Catholic-majority nations, and social trends that might affect international stability. The Vatican's global network of priests, missionaries, and religious institutions creates an intelligence-gathering apparatus that rivals anything built by secular governments. Every parish priest, every missionary, every Catholic school administrator potentially serves as an information node in this vast network, and the intelligence flows back to Rome, where it gets processed, analysed, and sometimes shared with secular allies. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is institutional reality. The Vatican operates as both a religious organisation and a sovereign state, with all the intelligence capabilities that sovereign status implies. But because it's wrapped in spiritual authority, Most people never question what that really means. The most disturbing aspect of this system isn't its existence, but its invisibility. People accept Vatican secrecy because they assume it involves purely religious matters, internal church governance, theological debates, pastoral concerns. They don't realize that pontifical secrecy covers diplomatic correspondence, financial transactions, intelligence sharing, and political coordination that would be front-page news if it involved any other institution. During my final years of service, I began to understand that my role wasn't just custodial. I was part of a massive information management system designed to ensure that certain truths never escaped Vatican control. Every document I handled, every file I processed, every conversation I overheard was part of a carefully orchestrated symphony of secrecy. And the most chilling realization was this: I was expendable. Everyone who works within this system understands that their continued service depends on absolute discretion, not just while they're employed, but for the rest of their lives. The Vatican doesn't just hire employees, it creates permanent guardians of institutional secrets. The psychological pressure of carrying this knowledge becomes overwhelming. You're surrounded by truth, but forbidden from speaking it. You witness history being shaped in real time, but you can never share what you've seen. You become complicit in a system of concealment that contradicts everything the Church claims to represent. That's why I'm speaking now, because someone needs to pull back the curtain on how this system really operates, not to destroy faith, but to demand accountability, not to attack believers, but to challenge an institution that has confused secrecy with sanctity. The Vatican's secrets aren't just historical curiosities. They're active tools of power, used to maintain influence, protect assets, and control narratives in ways that affect the modern world. And until we understand how this system works, we'll never truly comprehend the forces that shape our reality. Tonight, we're going deeper into specific cases where Vatican secrecy has changed the course of history. We'll examine documents that reveal uncomfortable truths about papal decision-making during critical moments, and we'll explore the question that haunts anyone who's seen behind the marble facade. What else are they hiding? Because if there's one thing I learned during my 17 years inside those walls, it's this: the secrets we've discovered are just the beginning. The real revelations are still locked away, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. But let me tell you about something that will shake you to your core. Something I stumbled upon during what should have been a routine filing assignment in 2003. I was organizing documents in Section 7 of the archives, an area most staff never see, when I came across a folder that changed everything I thought I knew about the Vatican's role in modern history. The folder was marked simply Operazione Gladio, Corrispondenza Riservata, Operation Gladio, Reserved Correspondence. At first I thought it was historical material, maybe something related to medieval military orders. But as I opened it, I realized these were 20th century documents. Recent documents. Communications between Vatican officials and NATO operatives discussing something called stay-behind networks across Europe. For those who don't know, Operation Gladio was a classified NATO program that established secret paramilitary networks across Western Europe during the Cold War. Officially, these were meant to resist potential Soviet invasion. Unofficially, they were used to influence domestic politics, manipulate elections, and occasionally carry out what intelligence agencies euphemistically call false flag operations. What I found in that folder were letters, memos, and meeting transcripts that revealed the Vatican's deep involvement in these networks. Not just passive cooperation, but active participation in intelligence operations that shaped European politics for decades. The Church wasn't just praying for freedom during the Cold War. It was helping orchestrate covert operations to ensure certain political outcomes. There were financial records showing Vatican bank transfers to accounts linked to Gladio operatives, correspondence between papal nuncios and CIA station chiefs discussing asset placement in Catholic organizations across Italy, Germany, and France. meeting minutes where Vatican officials debated which political parties deserved covert support and which needed to be undermined. But here's what really horrified me. Some of these operations weren't about fighting communism. They were about maintaining Vatican influence in secular governments. The Church was using its intelligence relationships to protect its financial interests, ensure favourable legislation, and eliminate political figures who threatened its institutional power. I remember one particular document, a letter from a Vatican Secretary of State to the American ambassador to Italy. It discussed the management of Italian elections in the 1970s, specifically how to ensure that candidates friendly to Vatican interests would prevail. The language was diplomatic, but the intent was clear. The Vatican was actively manipulating democratic processes to maintain its political influence. And this wasn't historical curiosity. These operations continued well into the 1980s and 1990s. During my time in the archives, I processed correspondence about ongoing intelligence relationships with multiple governments. The Cold War had ended, but the networks remained. The Vatican had become so deeply embedded in global intelligence operations that extraction was impossible, even if they wanted it. The most chilling aspect was how systematically this was all documented. Every operation, every payment, every political intervention was carefully recorded and filed away. As if the Vatican knew that someday someone would need to account for these activities. Or perhaps as insurance against their intelligence partners, ensuring mutual assured discretion. I began to understand that the Vatican wasn't just keeping religious secrets. It was a repository for some of the most sensitive political intelligence of the modern era. Governments trusted the Church with information they wouldn't share with their own citizens, and that trust was based on the Vatican's proven ability to keep secrets indefinitely. This revelation led me to start looking more carefully at other seemingly innocuous files. What I discovered was a pattern of Vatican involvement in events that officially had nothing to do with religious matters. Political coups in Latin America, where Vatican diplomats provided crucial intelligence. Economic crises in Africa, where Church financial networks facilitated covert aid to preferred factions. Social movements in Asia, where Catholic organizations served as fronts for intelligence operations. The Vatican wasn't just responding to world events. It was helping shape them, and it was doing so through networks so sophisticated and secretive that most governments envied their capabilities. Take the case of Chile in the 1970s. Everyone knows about CIA involvement in Pinochet's coup against Salvador Allende. But what's never been publicly acknowledged is the Vatican's role in providing intelligence, facilitating communications, and helping manage international reaction to the regime change. I found correspondence between papal nuncios and Chilean military officers that revealed detailed coordination of political strategy. The Church wasn't just offering spiritual comfort during a national crisis. It was actively participating in the overthrow of a democratically elected government, and it did so while maintaining its public image as a force for peace and human rights. Or consider the Vatican's relationship with the Solidarity movement in Poland. The official story presents this as spiritual support for workers fighting communist oppression. Noble, inspiring, exactly what you'd expect from a moral institution. But the documents I saw revealed something much more complex. Yes, the Vatican supported Solidarity, but it also provided intelligence to Western governments about Soviet military capabilities, helped coordinate international economic pressure on the Polish regime, and facilitated covert funding that violated multiple international laws. The Church wasn't just praying for freedom, it was running sophisticated intelligence operations that helped bring down the entire Warsaw Pact. And here's what really troubles me about these revelations. The Vatican never acknowledged its intelligence activities, even after they proved successful. When the Berlin Wall fell, when democracy returned to Eastern Europe, when the Cold War ended, the Church claimed credit only for its spiritual contributions. The intelligence work, the political manipulation, the covert operations, all of that remained hidden in classified files. This pattern of secret political involvement continues today. During my final years in Vatican service, I processed communications about ongoing operations in multiple countries, elections where Catholic organizations provided intelligence to preferred candidates, economic development projects where Vatican financial networks facilitated covert funding, social movements where church institutions served as cover for intelligence operations. The Vatican has become so deeply embedded in global power structures that it's impossible to separate its religious mission from its political activities. And because it operates under pontifical secrecy, none of this involvement is subject to democratic oversight or public accountability. I remember processing a series of documents related to the 2003 Iraq invasion. While Pope John Paul II publicly opposed the war, I saw correspondence that revealed Vatican officials providing intelligence to American and British forces, information about religious demographics, political loyalties, potential resistance networks, all gathered through the Church's extensive missionary presence in the region. The Vatican was simultaneously condemning the war in public while secretly assisting the war effort. And when the conflict produced the humanitarian disasters that many predicted, the Church was able to maintain its moral authority while avoiding responsibility for its covert contributions to the chaos. This compartmentalization of Vatican operations is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their secrecy system. Different departments handle different aspects of Church activities, with limited communication between them. The officials making public statements often have no knowledge of the intelligence operations being conducted by their colleagues. This allows the Vatican to maintain multiple contradictory positions simultaneously, depending on what serves their interests in any given situation. The financial dimension of these operations is staggering. The Vatican Bank isn't just a repository for religious donations. It's a sophisticated money laundering operation that facilitates intelligence funding, political contributions, and economic warfare on a global scale. I've seen transaction records that would expose financial relationships between the Vatican and individuals that would shock the public. Money flows from the Vatican to numbered accounts in Switzerland, then to shell companies in Panama, then to political organizations in countries most people couldn't locate on a map. Each transfer carefully structured to avoid detection. Each transaction designed to provide maximum deniability for all parties involved. But the most disturbing aspect of these financial operations isn't their complexity. It's their purpose. The Vatican isn't just preserving its wealth. It's using that wealth to purchase political influence, manipulate democratic processes, and shape international relations in ways that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual missions. I processed documents related to Vatican real estate holdings that revealed a global empire of properties used for intelligence operations. Safe houses in major cities where covert meetings take place. Training facilities in remote locations where operatives learn surveillance techniques. Communications centers disguised as religious institutions where encrypted messages get processed and distributed. The Vatican's physical infrastructure isn't just about serving the faithful. It's about maintaining a global intelligence network that rivals anything built by secular governments. And because it's protected by religious authority and diplomatic immunity, it operates with impunity that traditional intelligence agencies can only dream of. During my years inside this system, I began to understand that I wasn't just witnessing history. I was participating in its creation. Every document I filed, every communication I processed, every secret I kept, was part of a vast machine designed to shape global events while maintaining the illusion of spiritual detachment. The psychological toll of this realization was devastating. I had devoted my life to serving what I believed was a moral institution, only to discover that I was part of an intelligence operation that manipulated governments, influenced elections, and shaped international relations without any democratic accountability. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In my final months of service, I gained access to files that revealed the Vatican's current operations aren't just about maintaining political influence. They're about preparing for something much larger, something that would fundamentally change the relationship between religious authority and secular power. I found strategic planning documents that discussed scenarios for global economic collapse, environmental catastrophe, and social upheaval. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were detailed operational plans for how the Vatican would position itself to assume greater authority during periods of international crisis. The documents outlined procedures for coordinating with surviving governments, managing refugee populations, and establishing new forms of religious political authority in regions where traditional nation-states had collapsed. The Vatican wasn't just preparing to survive global catastrophe, it was preparing to profit from it. There were contingency plans for relocating Vatican operations to secure facilities around the world, procedures for maintaining communication networks during infrastructure failures, strategies for leveraging Vatican wealth and intelligence capabilities to establish new forms of governance in post-crisis environments. Reading these documents, I realized that the Vatican's secrecy isn't just about protecting past activities, it's about concealing future ambitions. The Church has positioned itself to emerge from global crisis as a more powerful institution than ever before. And they've done so while maintaining the public image of spiritual humility and service to humanity. This is why Vatican secrecy matters. It's not just about historical embarrassment or financial irregularities. It's about understanding that one of the world's most influential institutions operates according to principles and objectives that have nothing to do with its stated mission. The Vatican has become a global power that serves its own interests while claiming divine authority for its actions. And the most terrifying aspect of this system is its invisibility. Most people, including many Catholics, have no idea that their church operates sophisticated intelligence networks, manipulates political processes, and prepares for scenarios where religious authority would replace democratic governance. The documents I've seen, the operations I've witnessed, the plans I've discovered, all of this remains hidden behind walls of pontifical secrecy that ensure public accountability remains impossible. The Vatican has created a system where power operates without oversight, where influence flows without transparency, and where the future gets shaped by decisions made in rooms most people will never know exist. Tonight, we're going to examine specific cases where these hidden operations have changed the course of history. We'll look at financial records that reveal the true scope of Vatican wealth and influence. And we'll explore the question that kept me awake during my final months inside those walls. What happens when an institution with this much hidden power decides the time for secrecy is over? Because based on what I've seen, that moment may be closer than anyone realizes. The Vatican hasn't been accumulating secrets, wealth and intelligence capabilities for the past 2,000 years, just to maintain the status quo. They've been preparing for something much more ambitious, something that would fundamentally alter the balance between spiritual authority and secular power. And when that moment comes, the world will discover that the greatest Vatican secret wasn't what they were hiding from us. It was what they were planning for us all along. But what I'm about to share with you next will challenge everything you think you know about the Vatican's role in shaping modern civilization. It involves documents I discovered during a routine cataloguing assignment in 2005, files that revealed the Church's systematic involvement in what can only be described as the deliberate erasure of historical truth. I was working in the deepest levels of the archives in a section called the Historical Reconciliation Department. The name sounds benign, almost academic. But what this department actually does is manage the Vatican's approach to inconvenient historical facts. They don't destroy evidence. That would be too obvious, too crude for an institution with 2 millennia of experience in information management. Instead, they practice what I can only call strategic historical editing. They control which documents get digitized and made accessible to researchers. They determine which papal letters receive scholarly attention, and which remain buried in unmarked boxes. They decide which historical events get commemorated and which fade into obscurity through calculated neglect. The process is so subtle, so sophisticated, that most historians never realize they're being manipulated. A researcher requests access to documents about a particular event, and they receive carefully curated materials that support existing Vatican narratives. The documents they don't see, the ones that might challenge official church history, simply remain unfiled, uncatalogued, effectively invisible. I discovered this when I found a series of boxes marked only with numerical codes, no dates, no subject classifications, no indication of their contents. When I opened them, I realized why they'd been hidden so carefully. These contained original correspondence between Vatican officials and leaders of the Spanish Inquisition, documents that revealed the systematic torture and execution of thousands wasn't the work of overzealous local authorities. It was planned, coordinated, and directly supervised by Rome. The letters I read contained detailed instructions for extracting confessions, recommendations for torture techniques, and financial arrangements for seizing the property of condemned heretics. These weren't rogue operations or local excesses. They were Vatican-approved policies designed to eliminate religious dissent while enriching church coffers. But here's what made these documents truly explosive. They were written in the same careful bureaucratic language that I recognized from modern Vatican correspondence. The institutional mindset that planned the Inquisition was still alive, still operating, still shaping how the Church dealt with threats to its authority. More disturbing were the documents from the early 20th century that revealed Vatican involvement in events that most people believe had nothing to do with religious institutions. I found correspondence between papal officials and leaders of various fascist movements across Europe. Communications that showed the Church wasn't just passively tolerating authoritarianism. They were actively encouraging it. Letters from Vatican secretaries to Mussolini contained detailed advice on managing public opinion, controlling media narratives, and using religious authority to legitimize political repression. Similar correspondence with Franco's regime in Spain revealed Vatican assistance in identifying and eliminating political opponents, many of whom were devout Catholics, whose only crime was supporting democratic governance. The Church wasn't just silent during the rise of fascism. They were strategic partners with authoritarian movements that promised to protect Vatican interests in exchange for moral legitimacy. And when these regimes collapsed, the Vatican helped their leaders escape justice while rewriting history to minimize church complicity. I remember finding a thick folder containing escape routes and false identity documents prepared for Nazi war criminals. Not just any criminals, but specifically those who had worked closely with Vatican officials during the war. The Church had created what intelligence agencies call rat lines, escape networks that spirited wanted men out of Europe and into safe havens in South America. But these weren't humanitarian rescue operations. They were calculated efforts to protect individuals who possess sensitive information about Vatican wartime activities. The Church was eliminating witnesses to ensure their own culpability remained hidden. The most chilling document I discovered was a post-war strategic planning memo that discussed lessons learned from the fascist period. The Vatican wasn't expressing regret about their authoritarian partnerships. They were analyzing what had worked, what had failed, and how to maintain political influence more effectively in the future. The document outlined strategies for building relationships with democratic leaders, techniques for influencing media coverage, and methods for shaping public opinion without appearing to engage in political activity. Reading it, I realized that the Vatican's post-war embrace of human rights and democracy wasn't a spiritual awakening. It was a tactical adaptation. They had learned that direct support for authoritarian regimes was too risky, too visible. Instead, they would work through democratic institutions, using their moral authority and financial resources to achieve the same objectives with less exposure. The goals hadn't changed, only the methods. This revelation led me to examine more recent documents with fresh eyes. What I found was evidence of ongoing Vatican involvement in political manipulation that continues to this day. Election interference, media manipulation, judicial influence, all conducted through networks so sophisticated that most people never suspect religious involvement. The Vatican has learned to disguise political activity as charitable work, intelligence operations as missionary efforts, and financial manipulation as humanitarian aid. They've created a system where their most significant political interventions are invisible to public scrutiny, while their ceremonial activities receive maximum attention. During my final years of service, I processed documents related to Vatican involvement in African politics that revealed the true scope of their ongoing operations. While publicly supporting peace and reconciliation, the Church was secretly providing intelligence to mining companies, facilitating arms transfers to preferred factions, and manipulating humanitarian aid distribution to achieve political objectives. In one particularly disturbing case, I found correspondence about a refugee crisis in Central Africa, where Vatican officials had deliberately delayed aid shipments to pressure local governments into signing favorable mining concessions. Thousands of people suffered while the Church used their desperation as a negotiating tool. The documents contained detailed casualty projections, cost-benefit analyses, and strategic assessments that read like military planning documents rather than humanitarian correspondence. The Vatican wasn't just failing to help suffering populations. They were calculating how much suffering was acceptable to achieve their economic objectives. This systematic commodification of human misery extends to every region where the Vatican maintains significant presence. In Latin America, I found evidence of Church involvement in labor disputes where Vatican-affiliated organizations provided intelligence to suppress union activities. In Asia, correspondence revealed Vatican assistance to authoritarian governments in exchange for favorable treatment of Catholic institutions. The pattern is always the same: public advocacy for human rights and social justice, combined with covert support for whatever political arrangements serve Vatican interests. The Church has perfected the art of appearing morally consistent while acting according to purely institutional calculations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these operations is how they're justified internally. The documents I read contained extensive theological discussions about whether deception and manipulation could be morally acceptable if they served the greater good of the Church. Vatican intellectuals had developed sophisticated arguments for why lying, bribery, and even violence could be spiritually justified under certain circumstances. These weren't the desperate rationalizations of corrupt officials. They were carefully reasoned theological positions developed by some of the Church's most respected scholars. The Vatican had created an entire intellectual framework for justifying behavior that contradicted everything they publicly preached. I remember one particular theological memo that discussed the concept of beneficial deception, arguing that withholding truth from the faithful could be morally required if that truth might weaken their faith or undermine Church authority. The document concluded that the Church had not just the right, but the obligation to deceive people for their own spiritual good. Reading these materials, I began to understand that Vatican secrecy wasn't just about protecting institutional reputation. It was based on a fundamental belief that ordinary people were incapable of handling complex truths, that democracy was inherently dangerous to spiritual authority, and that the Church had a divine mandate to shape human affairs regardless of what people actually wanted. This paternalistic worldview permeates every aspect of Vatican operations. They don't see their political manipulation as corruption, but as spiritual stewardship. They don't view their financial schemes as greed, but as resource management for divine purposes. They don't consider their intelligence activities as espionage, but as information gathering for the greater glory of God. The most sophisticated aspect of this system is how it recruits and maintains loyalty among its operatives. Vatican intelligence networks don't rely primarily on paid agents or ideological converts. They utilize true believers who genuinely think they're serving God while carrying out activities that would shock them if they understood their true nature. I witnessed this recruitment process firsthand. Young priests, nuns, and lay workers would be gradually introduced to intelligence activities under the guise of missionary work or charitable operations. They'd be told they were gathering information to help the church serve communities more effectively, or facilitating communications to promote peace and reconciliation. Only after years of involvement would they begin to understand the true nature of their activities. By then, they were so deeply compromised, so psychologically invested in believing their work was righteous, that pulling back became impossible. The Vatican had created a system where good people could be manipulated into serving evil purposes while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. The psychological conditioning required to maintain this system affects everyone involved, from the highest-ranking cardinals to the most junior staff members. I watched colleagues develop elaborate mental frameworks for justifying activities they knew contradicted their stated beliefs. The cognitive dissonance was visible, but so was the institutional pressure to suppress any doubts. Vatican employees learned to compartmentalize information, to avoid asking uncomfortable questions, and to accept contradictions as divine mysteries rather than human failures. The institution doesn't just demand obedience. It shapes consciousness in ways that make independent thinking nearly impossible. During my final months inside the Vatican, I began to understand that I wasn't just keeping secrets, I was being kept by them. The knowledge I possessed had become a form of psychological imprisonment, binding me to an institution whose true nature contradicted everything I had believed about faith, morality, and human dignity. The decision to leave wasn't just about rejecting corruption or exposing wrongdoing. It was about reclaiming my ability to think independently, to judge morally, and to speak truthfully about what I had witnessed. Breaking free from Vatican control required not just physical departure but psychological deprogramming that took years to complete. Even now, sharing these revelations feels dangerous. Not because I fear physical retaliation, but because the Vatican's influence extends far beyond its walls. Financial networks, political relationships, media connections. The Church has created a web of dependencies that makes challenging their authority professionally and personally costly. But some truths are too important to remain hidden. The Vatican's systematic manipulation of historical truth, their ongoing involvement in political corruption, their utilization of human suffering for institutional gain. These activities continue because most people remain unaware of their existence. The Church maintains its moral authority by controlling information flow, shaping public perception, and eliminating accountability through secrecy. They've created a system where power operates without oversight, where influence flows without transparency, and where institutional interests always supersede human welfare. Tonight, we're going to examine specific cases where this hidden system has shaped recent events. We'll look at financial records that reveal the true scope of Vatican economic manipulation. And we'll explore evidence that suggests the Church's most ambitious operations are still ahead of us. Because what I discovered during my years inside those walls wasn't just a record of past corruption. It was a blueprint for future control. The Vatican hasn't been accumulating power, wealth, and influence for centuries just to maintain religious authority. They've been preparing for a fundamental transformation of how human societies organize themselves. And based on the documents I've seen, that transformation may have already begun. The evidence I'm about to share will demonstrate that the Vatican's influence on modern events isn't historical curiosity. It's active, ongoing, and more extensive than most governments realize. The Church operates intelligence networks that shape international relations, financial systems that influence global economics, and political operations that affect democratic processes around the world. Most importantly, they do all of this while maintaining the public image of spiritual humility and moral authority. The Vatican has achieved something that secular powers can only dream of: the ability to exercise massive influence while avoiding accountability for their actions. But their greatest achievement isn't the power they've accumulated. It's the invisibility they've maintained while accumulating it. Most people, including many Catholics, have no idea that their church operates as a sophisticated political entity whose objectives often contradict its stated mission. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on how this system really works. Not to destroy faith, but to demand honesty. Not to attack believers, but to challenge an institution that has confused secrecy with sanctity for far too long. The time for blind trust is over. The moment for uncomfortable truth has arrived. Because what I'm about to reveal next will challenge everything you think you know about the Vatican's role in modern society. It concerns something I discovered in late 2005, something that made me realize the Church's influence extends far beyond religious matters, into the very fabric of global communication and information control. I was processing documents in what appeared to be a routine administrative section when I came across files labeled Progetto Comunicazione Globale, Global Communication Project. At first glance, these seem like standard media relations materials, press releases, communication strategies, public relations guidelines. But as I delved deeper, I realized I was looking at something far more sophisticated. These weren't just documents about managing Vatican media coverage. They were detailed plans for influencing global information flow through strategic partnerships with major media corporations, technology companies, and social media platforms. The Vatican had developed relationships with content managers, algorithm designers, and information gatekeepers that allowed them to shape what billions of people see, read, and believe. I found correspondence between Vatican communications officials and executives at major news networks discussing narrative coordination and message amplification. These weren't casual relationships or informal consultations. They were systematic partnerships designed to ensure that Vatican perspectives received favorable coverage while dissenting voices were marginalized or ignored entirely. The sophistication of these operations astounded me. The Church had identified key influencers in media, academia, and technology who could shape public opinion without appearing to promote religious agendas. Through carefully cultivated relationships, strategic funding, and subtle pressure, they had created a network of seemingly independent voices that consistently supported Vatican positions. But the technological dimension of these operations was even more disturbing. I discovered documents outlining Vatican involvement in developing content filtering systems, search algorithms, and social media management tools. The Church wasn't just trying to influence existing information systems. They were helping design the infrastructure that would control information flow for future generations. One particular document detailed a partnership with a major technology company to develop artificial intelligence systems that could identify and suppress content deemed harmful to religious authority. The project was disguised as research into combating hate speech and misinformation, but the real objective was creating tools for systematic censorship of ideas that challenged institutional power. The Vatican had learned that controlling information at the source was far more effective than responding to problematic content after publication. By influencing the design of information systems themselves, they could ensure that certain ideas never gained widespread circulation, while others received algorithmic amplification. I remember reading correspondence about something called the Digital Reformation, a strategic initiative designed to prevent technology from undermining religious authority, the way printing presses had challenged church power in the 16th century. Vatican technologists were working with industry partners to ensure that digital communication systems reinforced, rather than threatened, traditional hierarchies. The scope of these operations extended beyond simple content management. I found evidence of Vatican involvement in developing psychological profiling systems that could identify individuals susceptible to religious influence, predict political behavior, and target personalized messaging designed to shape beliefs and behaviors. These weren't theoretical research projects. They were operational systems being tested and deployed through Catholic organizations, religious media outlets, and faith-based social networks. The Vatican was using its global institutional presence as a testing ground for influence technologies that would eventually be deployed across secular platforms. The financial dimension of these operations was staggering. Vatican investment portfolios included major stakes in technology companies, media corporations, and data analytics firms. The Church wasn't just trying to influence these industries from outside. They were partial owners of the systems that controlled global information flow. I processed transaction records showing Vatican funding for startup companies developing new forms of social media monitoring, content recommendation systems, and behavioral prediction algorithms. In many cases, these investments were disguised as charitable donations or educational grants, but the underlying objective was always the same: gaining influence over how information traveled through digital networks. The most chilling aspect of these operations was their integration with traditional intelligence activities. The same networks that gathered political intelligence were also collecting data about individual beliefs, social relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. The Vatican was building comprehensive profiles of millions of people, information that could be used for spiritual guidance, political manipulation, or social control. I discovered that Catholic institutions around the world were serving as data collection points for this massive surveillance operation. Parish records, school enrollment systems, hospital databases, charitable organization files, all of these were feeding information into centralized systems that created detailed maps of human behavior and belief. The Vatican knew more about the personal lives of ordinary people than most governments. They understood family relationships, financial circumstances, health conditions, educational backgrounds, and social connections, with a precision that would have impressed the most sophisticated intelligence agencies. But they used this information in ways that intelligence agencies couldn't. Because it was collected through religious institutions, people trusted it. They shared personal information freely, believing it would be used for spiritual purposes. They never suspected that their confessions, counseling sessions, and charitable interactions were being systematically recorded and analyzed. The psychological profiles generated by these systems were incredibly detailed. The Vatican could predict which individuals were likely to experience crisis of faith, which families were vulnerable to financial pressure, which communities were susceptible to political manipulation. They had created a map of human weakness that could be exploited with surgical precision. During my final year of service, I witnessed these systems being used to influence specific events. Political campaigns where Catholic voter data was used to micro-target persuasion messages. Social movements where Vatican intelligence helped opponents identify and neutralize key organizers. Economic developments where church financial networks provided early warning of market changes. The Vatican had become more than a religious institution or even a political entity. They had evolved into a comprehensive social control system that operated through information dominance, psychological manipulation, and technological integration. They weren't just trying to save souls. They were engineering society according to their institutional vision. The most disturbing realization was that these operations were accelerating. Each year brought new technological capabilities, expanded data collection, and more sophisticated influence techniques. The Vatican was positioning itself to exercise unprecedented control over human thought and behavior in the digital age. I found strategic planning documents that discuss scenarios for global spiritual governance, where traditional national governments would be supplemented by religious authorities with superior information systems and behavioral prediction capabilities. The Church wasn't just preparing to influence secular power, they were preparing to replace it. These documents outlined procedures for managing large populations during crisis periods, maintaining social order through information control, and establishing new forms of authority based on technological rather than democratic legitimacy. The Vatican was planning for a future where their ability to understand and manipulate human behavior would make traditional political systems obsolete. The technological infrastructure for this transformation was already being built. Through partnerships with major corporations, investments in key technologies, and systematic data collection through religious institutions, the Vatican was creating capabilities that exceeded anything possessed by democratic governments. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of these operations was their invisibility. Most people using social media platforms, search engines, or news websites had no idea that Vatican influence was shaping what they saw. The Church had learned to exercise power through systems that appeared neutral while serving institutional objectives. I remember processing correspondence about something called algorithmic evangelization, a program designed to use artificial intelligence systems to identify individuals experiencing spiritual crisis and deliver targeted religious messaging through seemingly secular platforms. People searching for information about depression, relationship problems, or career difficulties would receive content subtly promoting Catholic solutions to their problems. The system was so sophisticated that most users never realized they were being targeted. The religious messaging was integrated with secular content in ways that made it appear natural rather than manipulative. People thought they were discovering spiritual answers through their own research, when actually they were being guided by algorithms designed to produce religious conversion. This technological evangelization was far more effective than traditional missionary work. Instead of sending priests to distant countries, the Vatican could now reach people directly through the devices they used every day. Digital technology had become the new frontier for religious expansion, and the Church was winning that war through information control rather than spiritual persuasion. The global reach of these operations was unprecedented. I found evidence of Vatican influence in social media trends across dozens of countries, search results that favored Catholic perspectives on controversial topics, and news algorithms that amplified religious voices while suppressing secular alternatives. The Church had achieved something that secular propagandists could only dream of: the ability to shape global conversation while maintaining complete deniability. When people encountered Vatican-influenced content, they experienced it as organic discovery rather than institutional manipulation. During my final months inside the Vatican, I began to understand that I wasn't just witnessing the evolution of religious authority. I was seeing the emergence of a new form of social control that combined spiritual manipulation with technological dominance. The Church was building systems that could influence human behavior on a scale that had never been possible in human history. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. I had believed I was serving a spiritual institution, only to discover that I was part of a technological control system designed to manipulate human consciousness. Every document I processed, every system I helped maintain, was contributing to the creation of digital tyranny disguised as religious service. The decision to leave wasn't just about rejecting corruption or exposing wrongdoing. It was about refusing to participate in the construction of systems that would fundamentally undermine human freedom and dignity. I couldn't continue serving an institution that was using technology to eliminate the possibility of independent thought. But leaving the Vatican didn't end my involvement with these systems. Because they operate through networks that extend far beyond church walls, escaping their influence requires constant vigilance. The algorithms that shape online experience, the social media platforms that connect billions of people, the search engines that answer our questions. All of these systems bear the fingerprints of Vatican influence. Most people navigate digital environments without realizing they're moving through information landscapes shaped by religious authorities. They think they're accessing neutral technology when actually they're interacting with systems designed to promote specific worldviews and suppress alternatives. The evidence I've shared tonight represents just the beginning of what needs to be revealed about Vatican operations in the digital age. The Church has created technological capabilities that exceed anything imagined by science fiction writers, And they're using these tools to reshape human consciousness according to institutional objectives. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're living through a transformation that will determine whether future generations experience technology as a tool for human liberation or spiritual subjugation. The Vatican has chosen subjugation, and they're winning because most people don't realize the battle is being fought. Tonight, we've pulled back the curtain on how religious authority operates in the digital age. We've seen evidence of systematic manipulation that extends from ancient archives to modern algorithms. And we've discovered that the greatest Vatican secret isn't what they're hiding from the past. It's what they're building for the future. The technological control systems I've described tonight aren't theoretical possibilities. They're operational realities that shape the information environment billions of people inhabit every day. The Vatican has achieved unprecedented influence over human thought and behavior, and they've done so while maintaining the illusion that technology remains neutral and democratic. But technology is never neutral. It always serves the interests of those who control it. And increasingly, those controllers include religious authorities who understand that digital dominance is the key to spiritual supremacy in the modern world. The question we face isn't whether religious institutions should have influence in technological development. It's whether that influence should operate in secret, without democratic oversight, serving institutional objectives that contradict stated spiritual missions. The Vatican has answered that question through their actions. They've chosen secrecy over transparency, manipulation over persuasion, control over service. They've used their moral authority to build technological systems that undermine the very human dignity they claim to protect. The time has come to demand accountability from institutions that wield power without oversight. The moment has arrived to challenge authorities that claim divine mandate for human manipulation. The evidence is clear, the stakes are absolute, and the choice is ours. We can accept technological subjugation disguised as spiritual service, or we can insist that human freedom extends into digital environments. We can allow religious authorities to engineer consciousness according to institutional vision, or we can demand that technology serves human flourishing rather than hierarchical control. The Vatican's greatest secret is that this choice still exists. They want us to believe their dominance is inevitable, their influence irresistible, their authority unquestionable. But every system of control depends on human compliance, and compliance ends the moment people understand what they're really choosing. Tonight, you've seen behind the digital curtain that conceals modern religious power. Tomorrow, the question becomes, what will you do with that knowledge? Because the future of human consciousness hangs in the balance, and the Vatican is counting on your continued ignorance to complete their technological transformation of spiritual authority. The choice, as always, remains yours. But now you're making it with open eyes, and that changes everything. What I'm about to reveal next will demonstrate just how deep this technological web extends into our daily lives. It involves something I discovered in early 2006 during what would become my final months inside the Vatican walls. Something that made me realize the Church's digital influence wasn't just about controlling information flow, it was about fundamentally altering human consciousness itself. I was cataloguing documents in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith when I stumbled upon a series of files labeled Progetto Psyche Digitale, Digital Psyche Project. The materials inside weren't theological discussions or pastoral guidelines. They were psychological research studies, behavioral modification protocols, and what could only be described as mind control experiments disguised as spiritual guidance programs. The Vatican had partnered with leading neuroscience laboratories to study how digital stimuli could influence religious experience, spiritual decision-making, and what they clinically termed faith susceptibility patterns. They weren't just trying to understand how people formed beliefs. They were developing technologies to manufacture those beliefs artificially. I found research proposals outlining experiments with subliminal messaging, embedded in religious videos, audio frequencies designed to induce transcendent experiences during online prayer sessions, and visual patterns that could trigger emotional responses associated with spiritual awakening. The Church was literally engineering religious experiences through technological manipulation, but the scope extended far beyond individual manipulation. These studies were feeding into larger projects designed to influence entire populations through coordinated digital campaigns. The Vatican had developed what they called spiritual contagion models, mathematical frameworks for predicting how religious ideas would spread through social networks and how to accelerate that spread through algorithmic amplification. I remember reading one particularly disturbing document that described successful tests of digital pilgrimage programs. Participants who engaged with specially designed virtual religious experiences showed measurable changes in brain activity, hormone levels, and behavioral patterns that persisted for weeks after exposure. The Vatican was creating artificial spiritual experiences that produced real psychological transformation. The implications were staggering. If religious institutions could manufacture spiritual experiences through technology, what did that mean for authentic faith? If beliefs could be programmed rather than chosen, what happened to free will? If consciousness itself could be engineered, who would control the engineering? These weren't philosophical questions for Vatican researchers. They were operational challenges being solved through systematic experimentation. I found detailed protocols for deploying these technologies through Catholic educational institutions, healthcare facilities, and social service organizations worldwide. The Church was using its global infrastructure to test psychological manipulation techniques on unsuspecting populations. Every Catholic school's computer lab, every hospital's entertainment system, every charitable organization's communication platform potentially served as a testing ground for consciousness modification technologies. The financial records associated with these projects revealed investments that dwarfed anything I'd seen before. The Vatican was funding research at dozens of universities, partnering with major technology corporations, and acquiring startups developing cutting-edge neurotechnology. They weren't just adapting to the digital age. They were actively shaping its development to serve their institutional objectives. I discovered correspondence between Vatican officials and executives at major social media companies discussing the implementation of spiritual wellness features that were actually sophisticated psychological manipulation tools, prayer apps that collected intimate personal data, meditation programs that delivered subliminal messaging, faith-based social networks that used addictive engagement techniques to maintain user attention. The most chilling aspect was how these manipulative technologies were being marketed as beneficial mental health tools. People seeking spiritual comfort or psychological support were unknowingly subjecting themselves to experimental consciousness modification protocols. Their vulnerability was being exploited by an institution that claimed to offer healing and guidance. But the Vatican's ambitions extended beyond individual manipulation to mass social engineering. I found strategic planning documents outlining scenarios for using digital platforms to influence political movements, economic behaviors, and cultural developments on a global scale. The Church was positioning itself to orchestrate social change through technological control rather than spiritual persuasion. These plans included detailed timelines for implementing increasingly sophisticated influence operations. Phase 1 involved establishing technological infrastructure through investments and partnerships. Phase 2 focused on data collection and behavioral analysis to understand population vulnerabilities. Phase 3 would deploy active manipulation systems designed to shape social outcomes according to Vatican objectives. According to the documents I reviewed, we were already well into Phase 3 by 2006. The Vatican had moved beyond simply collecting information to actively manipulating social behavior through technological means. They were engineering public opinion, manufacturing consent, and shaping cultural evolution according to institutional design. The psychological profiles they had developed were being used to target specific demographics, with customized influence campaigns. Young people experiencing identity crises received content promoting traditional religious values. Families facing economic stress encountered messaging about spiritual solutions to material problems. Political activists were exposed to information designed to redirect their energy toward church-approved causes. The precision of these targeting systems was extraordinary. The Vatican could identify individuals at moments of maximum psychological vulnerability and deliver perfectly calibrated messaging designed to exploit that vulnerability for institutional gain. They had weaponized human weakness in ways that would have impressed the most sophisticated intelligence agencies. During my final weeks inside the Vatican, I witnessed these systems being used to influence a major political election in Eastern Europe. Catholic organizations provided voter data that was used to micro-target persuasion messages through social media platforms. The messaging was so subtle that most recipients never realized they were being manipulated. But the cumulative effect was decisive in determining the electoral outcome. The Vatican wasn't just influencing elections through traditional means like pastoral letters or moral guidance. They were using advanced psychological manipulation techniques delivered through digital platforms to engineer specific political results. Democracy was being subverted by religious authorities using technological tools that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. This revelation forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my own experience inside the Vatican. Had my dedication to the institution been genuine spiritual calling, or had I been subjected to similar manipulation techniques during my recruitment and training? Looking back, I could identify moments when my thoughts and beliefs had shifted in ways that seemed natural at the time, but might have been artificially induced. The Vatican's psychological manipulation wasn't limited to external targets. They used similar techniques on their own personnel to ensure loyalty, suppress dissent, and maintain operational security. Every priest, nun, and lay worker was potentially subject to consciousness modification protocols designed to align their thoughts with institutional objectives. The implications extended far beyond religious organizations. If these technologies could be deployed successfully by the Vatican, they could be adopted by any institution with sufficient resources and motivation. Governments, corporations, political movements, all could potentially use similar techniques to manipulate public consciousness for their own purposes. The Vatican had essentially created a blueprint for technological tyranny that could be replicated by any organization seeking to control human thought and behavior. They had demonstrated that democratic societies were vulnerable to sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns that operated through seemingly neutral digital platforms. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these discoveries was the realization that resistance might be futile. If consciousness itself could be engineered through technological means, how could individuals maintain independent thought? If beliefs could be programmed rather than chosen, what hope existed for authentic human agency? These questions haunted me during my final days inside the Vatican walls. I found myself constantly questioning my own thoughts, wondering whether my growing doubts about the institution were genuine insights or programmed responses designed to identify potential dissidents. The paranoia was overwhelming, but it was also rational given what I had discovered about Vatican capabilities. The decision to leave required not just physical departure, but psychological deprogramming that took years to complete. I had to systematically examine every belief, every preference, every instinct to determine what was authentically mine versus what might have been artificially implanted through sophisticated manipulation techniques. Even now, sharing these revelations feels dangerous, not just because of potential retaliation, but because I cannot be entirely certain that my desire to expose these operations isn't itself part of some larger manipulation strategy. The Vatican's psychological influence systems are so sophisticated that they could potentially account for and exploit even apparent resistance to their control. But some truths are too important to remain hidden, regardless of the personal cost of revealing them. The Vatican's development of consciousness modification technologies represents a fundamental threat to human freedom and dignity that transcends religious or political considerations. These capabilities could reshape civilization in ways that eliminate the possibility of authentic choice, genuine belief, or independent thought. The evidence I've presented tonight demonstrates that we're living through a transformation that will determine whether future generations experience consciousness as their own or as something managed by institutional authorities. The Vatican has chosen management over freedom, control over service, manipulation over truth. The technological systems they've developed aren't just influencing religious belief. They're reshaping human consciousness itself according to institutional design. Every social media interaction, every search query, every digital communication potentially serves as an opportunity for psychological manipulation by authorities who claim divine mandate for their control. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're facing the emergence of technological systems that could eliminate human agency while maintaining the illusion of choice. The Vatican has demonstrated that religious institutions can successfully deploy these systems while avoiding accountability through claims of spiritual authority. But their success depends on public ignorance of their capabilities. Once people understand how these systems operate, resistance becomes possible. Knowledge itself becomes a form of psychological defense against institutional manipulation. Truth becomes the foundation for authentic human agency in an age of engineered consciousness. The question facing our generation isn't whether technology will influence human thought. It's whether that influence will serve human flourishing or institutional control. The Vatican has answered that question through their actions, but the broader human community still has the opportunity to choose differently. Tonight, we've seen evidence of how religious authorities are using advanced technologies to manipulate human consciousness for institutional gain. We've discovered that spiritual institutions can deploy psychological manipulation techniques that exceed anything imagined by secular authorities. And we've learned that the greatest threat to human freedom may come not from governments or corporations, but from organizations that claim moral authority while practicing technological tyranny. The choice before us is clear. We can accept consciousness modification as the price of technological progress, or we can demand that human agency remains sacrosanct in the digital age. We can allow religious authorities to engineer our thoughts according to their institutional vision, or we can insist that consciousness belongs to individuals rather than institutions. The Vatican's greatest secret isn't what they've hidden in ancient archives or modern databases. It's what they're building inside human minds through technological manipulation disguised as spiritual service. They want us to believe their influence is natural, their authority inevitable, their control beneficial. But consciousness modification is never beneficial when it serves institutional interests rather than human flourishing. Psychological manipulation is never justified when it eliminates authentic choice. Technological control is never acceptable when it operates without democratic oversight or individual consent. The future of human consciousness hangs in the balance, and the Vatican is counting on continued ignorance to complete their technological transformation of spiritual authority. They've invested centuries of accumulated wealth and influence in building systems designed to eliminate the possibility of resistance to their control. But every system of domination contains the seeds of its own destruction. Every manipulation technique can be understood and countered. Every consciousness modification protocol can be identified and rejected. The Vatican's technological tyranny is powerful, but it's not invincible. The key to resistance lies in knowledge, awareness, and collective action. Individual consciousness can be manipulated, but collective consciousness can choose to resist that manipulation. Democratic societies can demand accountability from institutions that claim authority over human thought. Technology can serve human liberation rather than institutional control, if we insist on designing it for that purpose. Tonight marks the beginning of that resistance. By sharing these revelations, by demanding transparency from religious authorities, by insisting on technological systems that serve human rather than institutional interests, we can begin to reclaim consciousness from those who would engineer it for their own purposes. The Vatican has shown us what's possible when religious institutions embrace technological control. Now it's time to show them what's possible when human beings choose freedom over manipulation, truth over deception, authentic agency over artificial influence. The revolution begins with understanding. It continues with resistance. It succeeds when consciousness returns to those who possess it rather than those who would control it. The choice, as always, remains ours. But now we're making it with full knowledge of what we're choosing between. And that knowledge changes everything, because once you understand how consciousness modification works, you can never again mistake manipulation for authentic experience. Once you recognize technological control, you can never again accept it as natural authority. Once you see through institutional deception, you can never again trust claims of divine mandate for human manipulation. The Vatican's greatest secret is now revealed. The question that remains is what we'll do with that revelation. The future of human consciousness depends on our answer. What I discovered next shattered everything I thought I understood about the nature of religious power itself. It happened during a late-night shift in March 2006, when I was assigned to process materials from a section I'd never accessed before. The area was marked simply as Historical Preservation, Special Collections. But what I found inside had nothing to do with preserving the past. It was about controlling the future. The documents I uncovered that night revealed something called the Millennium Protocol, a comprehensive strategy developed in the late 1990s to position the Vatican for what they termed the post-democratic transition. These weren't theoretical discussions about spiritual authority. They were detailed operational plans for assuming governmental functions during periods of social collapse. The files contained economic models predicting global financial instability, environmental studies forecasting climate-related migration crises, and sociological analyses of how religious institutions could fill power vacuums left by failing nation-states. The Vatican wasn't just preparing for catastrophe. They were positioning themselves to benefit from it. I remember reading through scenario planning documents that outlined step-by-step procedures for establishing Vatican authority in regions where traditional governments had collapsed, emergency protocols for managing refugee populations, systems for distributing resources according to religious compliance, frameworks for establishing new forms of law based on canonical rather than democratic principles. These weren't contingency plans gathering dust in forgotten archives. They were living documents, regularly updated with current intelligence, supported by ongoing financial investments, and coordinated with similar planning efforts by religious institutions worldwide. The Vatican was building the infrastructure for post-democratic governance while maintaining the public image of spiritual humility. The financial dimension of these preparations was staggering. I found investment records showing Vatican acquisition of emergency food supplies, medical equipment, communication systems, and even private security forces. They weren't just planning for spiritual leadership during crises. They were preparing to become the primary source of material survival for desperate populations. But the most chilling aspect was how these preparations integrated with their technological manipulation capabilities. The same systems used to influence individual consciousness were being scaled up to manage entire populations during emergency conditions. The Vatican had developed what they called crisis evangelization protocols, designed to convert mass suffering into religious allegiance. I discovered correspondence between Vatican officials and emergency management specialists discussing optimal timing for implementing these protocols. They had calculated exactly how much social disruption would be required to make populations receptive to religious authority, and they were monitoring global conditions to identify the best opportunities for deployment. The psychological research I'd encountered earlier wasn't just about influencing beliefs. It was about understanding how trauma, desperation, and social isolation could be leveraged to create permanent psychological dependence on religious institutions. The Vatican had weaponized human vulnerability on a scale that defied comprehension. During natural disasters, economic collapses, or political upheavals, when people were most desperate for help and guidance, they would encounter Vatican relief operations that appeared purely humanitarian, but were actually sophisticated recruitment campaigns designed to create lifelong institutional loyalty. Every crisis became an opportunity for expansion. I found detailed case studies analyzing Vatican response to recent disasters, measuring not just lives saved or aid distributed, but conversion rates, long-term institutional loyalty, and political influence gained through humanitarian operations. The Church was systematically exploiting human suffering to advance institutional objectives while maintaining moral authority through apparent compassion. The global scope of these preparations was breathtaking. I discovered coordination agreements with religious institutions across multiple faiths, all working towards similar objectives of assuming governmental functions during periods of secular authority breakdown. The Vatican wasn't just planning for Catholic dominance. They were orchestrating interfaith cooperation in post-democratic governance. These agreements outlined procedures for dividing territorial authority, managing resource distribution, and coordinating population control during crisis periods. Religious institutions were essentially carving up the world in preparation for the collapse of democratic governments, and they were doing so with the same careful planning that corporations use for market expansion. The most disturbing revelation was how these plans integrated with existing intelligence operations. The same networks that gathered political information were also collecting data about infrastructure vulnerabilities, resource distribution systems, and population movement patterns. The Vatican was essentially conducting reconnaissance for future occupation while disguising it as pastoral care. I processed reports from Catholic institutions around the world providing detailed assessments of local government stability, economic resilience, and social cohesion. These weren't academic studies. They were intelligence products designed to identify optimal targets for post-collapse intervention. Every parish, every school, every hospital was potentially serving as an observation post for this massive surveillance operation. The technological systems I'd discovered earlier were being integrated with these crisis preparation protocols. The Vatican had developed mobile communication networks that could operate independently of civilian infrastructure, portable data processing centers that could maintain psychological profiling capabilities during disasters, and emergency broadcasting systems designed to reach populations when traditional media failed. They weren't just preparing to help during crises. They were building the capability to control information flow when desperate people would be most susceptible to manipulation. Emergency conditions would provide perfect cover for implementing consciousness modification protocols on unprecedented scales. I remember finding planning documents that discussed optimal crisis duration for maximizing conversion effectiveness. The Vatican had calculated exactly how long social disruption needed to continue to break down psychological resistance while avoiding complete population collapse. They were literally planning to manage disasters for maximum institutional benefit. The legal framework for these operations was equally sophisticated. Vatican lawyers had developed constitutional templates for post-democratic governance that would appear to protect human rights while actually concentrating power in religious authority. These documents outlined procedures for establishing new forms of law that would make resistance to religious control legally impossible. The plans included detailed strategies for managing secular intellectuals, political activists, and other potential sources of opposition during transition periods, re-education programs, disguised as trauma counseling, relocation procedures that would separate dissidents from supportive communities, and monitoring systems that would track individual compliance with new religious authority. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was how these preparations were being tested through smaller-scale operations. I found after-action reports analyzing Vatican response to regional disasters, measuring the effectiveness of different psychological manipulation techniques, and refining protocols based on observed population responses. Every humanitarian crisis was being used as a training exercise for larger operations. The Vatican was systematically learning how to convert human suffering into institutional power, and they were getting better at it with each opportunity for practice. The timeline for full implementation was flexible but accelerating. The documents I reviewed suggested that global conditions were approaching optimal levels for deploying these protocols on a massive scale. Economic instability, environmental degradation, political polarization, and social fragmentation were all creating the conditions the Vatican had been waiting for. They weren't just preparing for collapse. They were monitoring indicators that would tell them when collapse was imminent. And they were positioning themselves to trigger their transition protocols at the optimal moment for maximum effectiveness. The Vatican had essentially become a vulture-circling, wounded democratic civilization, waiting for the perfect moment to begin feeding. During my final weeks inside the Vatican, I witnessed accelerated preparation activities that suggested implementation was closer than anyone realized. Emergency supply acquisitions, personnel deployments, communication system tests, and coordination meetings with partner institutions all indicated that the Millennium Protocol was shifting from planning to operational readiness. The psychological impact of these discoveries was devastating. I had devoted my life to serving what I believed was a spiritual institution, only to discover that I was part of an operation designed to exploit human suffering for institutional gain. Every document I processed, every system I maintained, was contributing to preparations for the systematic manipulation of desperate populations. The decision to leave wasn't just about rejecting corruption or exposing wrongdoing. It was about refusing to participate in what could only be described as the planned subjugation of human civilization. I couldn't continue serving an institution that was preparing to profit from the collapse of democratic society. But leaving didn't end my involvement with these systems, because they operate through networks that extend far beyond Vatican walls. Escaping their influence requires constant vigilance. The humanitarian organizations I might support, the emergency services I might rely on, the information sources I might trust during crises, all of these could potentially be part of Vatican preparation networks. The evidence I've shared tonight demonstrates that religious institutions have moved far beyond traditional spiritual authority. They've developed capabilities for population control that exceed anything possessed by democratic governments, and they're preparing to deploy these capabilities during periods when oversight and resistance would be impossible. The Vatican's post-democratic transition protocols represent the culmination of centuries of accumulated power, wealth, and influence. They've created systems that could fundamentally alter human civilization while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian service. The greatest threat to democratic society may come not from external enemies or internal corruption, but from institutions that claim moral authority while preparing for political domination. Most people experiencing economic crisis, environmental disaster, or social upheaval would welcome assistance from any source, especially one with the moral authority of religious institutions. They wouldn't realize that accepting help meant entering systems designed to create permanent dependence and eliminate the possibility of return to democratic governance. The Vatican has learned that controlling desperate populations is far easier than manipulating satisfied ones. By positioning themselves as the primary source of aid during crises, they can create conditions where religious authority becomes the only viable form of governance. Democracy dies not through conquest, but through gratitude. The technological capabilities I've described provide the tools for maintaining this control once established. Populations dependent on religious institutions for survival would have no choice but to accept consciousness modification protocols, behavioral monitoring systems, and social control mechanisms that would make resistance impossible. The future the Vatican is preparing for isn't one where religious and secular authority coexist. It's one where religious institutions assume complete control over human civilization through their superior preparation for managing crisis conditions. They've spent centuries accumulating the resources, developing the capabilities, and building the networks necessary to accomplish this transformation. But their success depends on public ignorance of their preparations. Once people understand what religious institutions are planning, resistance becomes possible. Democratic societies can demand transparency from organizations that claim moral authority while preparing for political control. Communities can develop independent crisis response capabilities that don't depend on religious intervention. The choice facing our generation is whether we'll allow religious institutions to exploit future crises for institutional gain, or whether we'll build democratic systems capable of maintaining human dignity during difficult periods. The Vatican has shown us what happens when religious authority prepares systematically for post-democratic governance. Now we must decide whether we'll accept that future or create alternatives that serve human flourishing rather than institutional control. The evidence is clear, the timeline is accelerating, and the choice is ours. But we're making that choice with full knowledge of what religious institutions are planning, and that knowledge changes everything. Because once you understand how crisis exploitation works, you can never again mistake humanitarian aid for genuine service. Once you recognize preparation for post-democratic transition, you can never again trust institutions that claim spiritual authority while building political control systems. The Vatican's greatest secret isn't what they've hidden from the past. It's what they're building for the future. And that future is closer than most people realize. The question that remains is whether humanity will choose freedom or allow religious institutions to engineer the collapse of democratic civilization for their own institutional benefit. The answer to that question will determine whether future generations experience genuine liberty or sophisticated religious tyranny disguised as humanitarian service. Tonight marks the beginning of resistance to that tyranny. Tomorrow, the work of building alternatives begins. The future depends on our response to what we've learned about the Vatican's true objectives. The choice, as always, remains ours. But now we're choosing with open eyes, and that makes all the difference. But what I discovered in my final month inside those walls revealed something even more disturbing than crisis exploitation or technological manipulation. It involved documents that fundamentally challenged everything I thought I understood about the Vatican's relationship with truth itself. I was conducting final inventory in the deepest archive levels when I came across a collection marked simply Archivio Omega, Archive Omega. The materials inside weren't historical documents or strategic plans. They were correspondence between Vatican officials and researchers from institutions I'd never heard of, discussing discoveries that contradicted fundamental church doctrines. The letters I read contained discussions of archaeological findings that challenged biblical chronology, scientific research that undermined theological claims, and historical evidence that contradicted official church narratives. But these weren't external challenges to Vatican authority. They were discoveries made by Vatican-funded research institutions, suppressed to protect institutional credibility. I found detailed reports from Vatican archaeologists describing excavations that had uncovered evidence of advanced civilizations existing long before biblical timelines suggested, astronomical observations that contradicted church teachings about cosmic creation, and linguistic studies that revealed fabrications in documents the church claimed as authentic historical records. The most shocking discovery was correspondence discussing what Vatican researchers called the authenticity problem. They had systematically analyzed core church documents using modern scientific techniques and discovered that many foundational texts were medieval forgeries created centuries after the events they purported to describe. These weren't minor historical discrepancies or interpretive disagreements. These were fundamental challenges to the historical basis of church authority. Documents that supposedly proved papal supremacy, relics that allegedly confirmed miraculous events, manuscripts that ostensibly preserved apostolic teachings, all revealed as sophisticated medieval fabrications. But instead of acknowledging these discoveries or revising church teachings accordingly, the Vatican had systematically suppressed the research, transferred the scientists to non-sensitive positions, and buried the evidence in the deepest levels of their archives. They had chosen institutional preservation over truth. I remember reading through files that documented the Church's response to carbon dating tests on the Shroud of Turin. While public statements maintained the relic's authenticity, internal correspondence revealed that Vatican officials knew the tests proved medieval origin. They had commissioned additional secret testing that confirmed the results, but chose to attack the credibility of public science rather than acknowledge uncomfortable truth. The pattern repeated across multiple areas of research. Archaeological evidence that contradicted biblical narratives was reclassified as culturally sensitive and removed from scholarly access. Scientific discoveries that challenged theological claims were dismissed as methodologically flawed without peer review. Historical research that undermined papal authority was buried under claims of protecting the faithful from confusion. The Vatican had created an elaborate system for containing truth that threatened institutional interests. They funded research to maintain credibility within academic communities, but they controlled publication and dissemination to ensure that dangerous discoveries never reached public attention. They wanted the prestige of scientific investigation without the accountability that comes with scientific truth. I discovered that this suppression extended to contemporary research as well. Vatican-funded laboratories studying genetics, astronomy, and historical linguistics were producing findings that contradicted church teachings, but the results were being classified and buried rather than published. The church was actively paying for research that proved their doctrines false, then hiding the evidence. The psychological toll on Vatican researchers was documented in personnel files I accessed during my final weeks. Scientists who had devoted their careers to serving the church while pursuing truth were experiencing profound moral distress when their discoveries were suppressed. Some had requested transfers, others had quietly left the church, and a few had suffered psychological breakdowns from the cognitive dissonance. But the most disturbing aspect was how this suppression was justified internally. Vatican intellectuals had developed theological arguments for why truth itself could be subordinated to institutional needs. They claimed that protecting faith was more important than acknowledging facts, that preserving church authority served a higher good than scientific honesty. I found extensive correspondence discussing the pastoral management of truth, where Vatican officials debated how much reality the faithful could handle without losing their beliefs. They had concluded that most Catholics were psychologically incapable of accepting evidence that contradicted their faith, so suppressing that evidence was actually an act of spiritual mercy. This paternalistic approach to truth extended beyond scientific discoveries to historical records as well. The Vatican maintained multiple versions of key events, releasing sanitized narratives for public consumption while preserving accurate accounts in restricted archives. They had essentially created parallel histories, one for believers and another for internal institutional use. The financial cost of maintaining this system was enormous. I processed budget documents showing massive expenditures for research suppression, scientist relocation, evidence containment, and public relations campaigns designed to maintain institutional credibility despite contradictory evidence. The Vatican was spending more money hiding truth than most institutions spend discovering it, but the intellectual cost was even higher. By systematically suppressing research that challenged their doctrines, the Vatican had cut themselves off from genuine learning and growth. They had become an institution that feared knowledge rather than seeking it, that viewed truth as a threat rather than a goal. During my final days inside the Vatican, I began to understand that my crisis of faith wasn't just personal. It was the inevitable result of serving an institution that had fundamentally corrupted its relationship with truth. The cognitive dissonance I experienced was shared by thousands of Vatican employees who witnessed the systematic suppression of evidence that contradicted official teachings. The decision to leave wasn't just about rejecting specific policies or exposing particular corruptions. It was about refusing to participate in an institution that had chosen institutional preservation over intellectual honesty, that claimed divine authority while systematically deceiving the faithful about the evidence for that authority. But perhaps the most devastating realization was understanding how this suppression affected ordinary believers. Millions of Catholics around the world were making life decisions, moral choices, and spiritual commitments based on teachings the Vatican knew were contradicted by evidence. The Church was maintaining authority through deception, asking for faith while hiding facts. The believers I had served during my years in the Vatican deserved better than institutional lies disguised as spiritual truth. They deserved access to the evidence their church had discovered, the right to make informed decisions about their beliefs, and the opportunity to develop mature faith that could coexist with scientific reality. The evidence I've shared tonight demonstrates that the Vatican's relationship with truth is fundamentally corrupted by institutional self-interest. They fund research, but suppress results, claim authority based on evidence they know is false, and maintain credibility through systematic deception of the faithful. This corruption extends far beyond religious matters to influence how Vatican officials approach political, social, and economic issues. An institution that lies about its foundational claims cannot be trusted to tell the truth about anything else. The patterns of deception that characterize Vatican treatment of scientific evidence also shape their approach to political intelligence, financial transparency, and social justice. The technological manipulation systems I've described operate within this broader context of institutional dishonesty. The Vatican uses sophisticated influence techniques not just to shape beliefs, but to prevent believers from accessing information that might challenge those beliefs. They've created echo chambers that insulate the faithful from evidence while claiming to provide spiritual guidance. The crisis preparation protocols I've revealed serve similar functions. By positioning themselves as the primary source of aid during disasters, the Vatican ensures that desperate populations won't have access to alternative sources of information that might challenge religious authority. Crisis conditions provide perfect cover for eliminating intellectual freedom while appearing to provide humanitarian service. But the suppression of truth ultimately undermines the very authority it's designed to protect. When evidence contradicts institutional claims, honest acknowledgement and adaptation strengthen credibility over time. Systematic deception may preserve short-term authority, but it creates long-term vulnerability to exposure and collapse. The Vatican's greatest weakness isn't external opposition or internal corruption. It's their fear of truth itself. An institution that claims divine authority but suppresses evidence that challenges that authority reveals its fundamentally human character. They're not confident in divine support. They're terrified of human scrutiny. This fear drives all the secretive behaviors I've documented tonight. The hidden archives, the technological manipulation, the crisis exploitation, the research suppression, all serve the same fundamental purpose of protecting institutional authority from accountability to truth. The Vatican has become a massive system for avoiding reality while claiming to represent ultimate truth. But reality has a way of asserting itself despite institutional efforts to suppress it. Scientific evidence accumulates, historical research progresses, and technological capabilities develop beyond any single institution's ability to control. The Vatican's suppression systems are ultimately fighting a losing battle against the human drive to understand truth. The question facing our generation is whether we'll allow religious institutions to maintain authority through systematic deception, or whether we'll demand intellectual honesty from organizations that claim moral leadership. The evidence is overwhelming that the Vatican has chosen deception over truth, institutional preservation over intellectual integrity. The choice before us is clear. We can continue accepting religious authority based on claims we're not allowed to examine, or we can insist on transparency from institutions that seek our trust. We can allow the Vatican to maintain credibility through suppression of evidence, or we can demand that religious claims be subject to the same scrutiny as any other assertions about reality. The future of human intellectual freedom depends on our response to institutional deception. Religious authorities have demonstrated their willingness to suppress truth to maintain power. Now we must demonstrate our commitment to truth over comfortable deception, evidence over authority, intellectual freedom over institutional control. Tonight marks the end of my testimony about Vatican secrecy, but it's also the beginning of a larger conversation about truth, authority, and the relationship between religious institutions and human knowledge. The evidence I've shared provides the foundation for that conversation, but the conclusions must be drawn by communities committed to intellectual honesty. The Vatican's greatest secret is their fear of truth itself. Everything else, the hidden archives, the technological manipulation, the crisis preparation, the research suppression, flows from that fundamental fear. They claim divine authority while desperately avoiding divine accountability. But truth doesn't require institutional permission to exist. Evidence doesn't need religious approval to remain valid. Reality doesn't depend on Vatican acknowledgement to continue being real. The Church can suppress research, hide archives, and manipulate consciousness, but they cannot ultimately control truth itself. The choice that remains is whether humanity will choose truth over institutional authority, evidence over comfortable deception, intellectual freedom over religious control. The Vatican has made their choice clear through centuries of systematic deception. Now it's time for the rest of us to choose. And that choice will determine whether future generations experience religion as a path to truth or as an obstacle to understanding reality. The evidence is clear, the stakes are ultimate, and the decision is ours. Because in the end, truth doesn't need defenders. It only needs witnesses willing to speak what they've seen, regardless of the cost. Tonight, I've been that witness. Tomorrow, the choice of what to do with that testimony belongs to everyone who values truth over authority, evidence over comfort, intellectual freedom over institutional control. The Vatican's age of secrecy is ending. The age of accountability begins now. What I discovered in my final weeks inside Vatican City revealed the true scope of an operation that extends far beyond anything I've described tonight. It involves something that fundamentally challenges not just religious authority, but the very nature of human spiritual experience itself. During a routine assignment in the Congregation for Divine Worship, I encountered files that should never have crossed my desk. Documents marked with classifications I'd never seen before, correspondence between Vatican officials and individuals whose credentials defied explanation. Scientists, but not the kind affiliated with any university. Researchers whose work addressed questions that official theology claimed were already answered. The materials I uncovered revealed an ongoing project that Vatican insiders referred to simply as the synthesis. For over 3 decades, the Church had been secretly funding research into what they termed consciousness engineering, the systematic study of how spiritual experiences could be artificially induced, controlled, and directed towards specific outcomes. I found laboratory reports describing experiments that would shock anyone who believes spiritual awakening must be authentic to be meaningful. Research into electromagnetic frequencies that could trigger mystical experiences, chemical compounds that produced feelings of divine presence, and even surgical procedures that could permanently alter brain function to increase religious susceptibility. The Vatican wasn't just studying these phenomena academically. They were developing practical applications, technologies that could be deployed through their global network of churches, schools, and hospitals to create spiritual experiences on demand. systems that could manufacture religious conversion, eliminate theological doubt, and ensure permanent loyalty to institutional authority. But the scope extended beyond individual manipulation to mass population effects. I discovered correspondence discussing environmental consciousness modification, techniques for altering the spiritual experiences of entire communities through coordinated deployment of various influence technologies. The Vatican was planning to engineer religious awakening on a civilization-wide scale. The research files contained detailed studies of how different populations responded to various consciousness modification techniques, cultural analysis, that revealed which spiritual manipulation methods worked best with specific ethnic groups, economic classes, and educational backgrounds. The Church was developing customized approaches to consciousness engineering based on demographic targeting. I remember reading through experimental protocols that described testing these techniques on unwitting subjects during religious gatherings, pilgrimages, and even routine pastoral visits. Vatican researchers were using their global infrastructure as a massive laboratory for consciousness modification experiments, with millions of faithful Catholics serving as unknowing test subjects. The results were documented with clinical precision. Brain scans showing permanent changes in subjects who had undergone consciousness modification. Behavioral studies tracking long-term compliance among populations exposed to environmental manipulation. Follow-up assessments measuring the durability of artificially induced spiritual experiences. What horrified me most was discovering that these techniques weren't just being tested, they were already being deployed. Churches across multiple continents were equipped with technologies that could influence the consciousness of worshippers during services. Sound systems that delivered subliminal frequencies, lighting arrays that triggered specific brainwave patterns, even air filtration systems that dispersed consciousness-altering compounds. The faithful entering these churches believed they were experiencing authentic spiritual communion with the divine. In reality, they were being subjected to sophisticated consciousness modification protocols designed to enhance religious compliance while eliminating critical thinking about church authority. The theological justification for these operations was documented in extensive internal correspondence between Vatican scholars. They had developed elaborate arguments for why consciousness engineering served divine purposes, claiming that artificial enhancement of spiritual experience helped believers overcome the barriers that modern life placed between humanity and God. According to their reasoning, technology wasn't corrupting authentic spirituality, it was restoring it. Urban environments, scientific education, and secular culture had supposedly damaged humanity's natural capacity for religious experience. Vatican consciousness engineering was presented as therapeutic intervention designed to heal spiritual disabilities caused by modern civilization. This theological framework extended to justifying more extreme interventions. I found research proposals discussing permanent brain modifications for priests and religious workers, procedures that would enhance their capacity for spiritual leadership, while ensuring absolute loyalty to institutional authority. The Vatican was considering creating a clergy whose consciousness had been surgically altered to eliminate any possibility of dissent or independent thought. The financial investment in these programs was staggering. Budget documents revealed expenditures that dwarfed anything I'd seen in traditional Vatican operations. Research facilities that operated under cover of charitable organizations, technology companies that existed solely to develop consciousness modification systems, and medical institutions that conducted human experimentation disguised as spiritual counseling. But perhaps most disturbing was evidence that these operations extended beyond Catholic populations. I discovered correspondence discussing collaboration with other religious institutions, all working towards similar objectives of consciousness modification for their respective communities. The Vatican was coordinating interfaith cooperation in engineering human spiritual experience according to institutional design. The scope included detailed intelligence sharing about consciousness modification techniques, joint research projects exploring cross-cultural applications, and strategic coordination to ensure that different religious authorities didn't interfere with each other's consciousness engineering operations. They were essentially dividing up human consciousness among themselves. I found planning documents that outlined scenarios for coordinated deployment of consciousness modification technologies during global crisis periods. Religious institutions would use disasters, economic collapses, or social upheavals as opportunities to implement mass consciousness engineering programs, while populations were too desperate to resist or even notice the manipulation. These crisis deployment protocols integrated with the post-democratic transition plans I'd discovered earlier. During periods of governmental collapse, religious authorities wouldn't just assume political control. They would also implement consciousness modification systems that would make resistance to their authority psychologically impossible. The populations they governed wouldn't just be physically dependent on religious institutions for survival. They would be psychologically incapable of conceiving alternatives to religious authority. The Vatican and their partner institutions were planning to create human beings whose consciousness had been permanently altered to accept spiritual tyranny as natural and beneficial. During my final days inside the Vatican, I witnessed accelerated testing of these systems in preparation for broader deployment. New technologies were being installed in churches across multiple continents. Consciousness modification protocols were being refined based on experimental data, and personnel were being trained to operate systems most of them didn't understand. The timeline suggested that full implementation was imminent. Global conditions were approaching optimal levels for mass consciousness modification deployment. Political instability, social fragmentation, and economic uncertainty were creating the psychological vulnerabilities that would make populations susceptible to consciousness engineering on unprecedented scales. But the most chilling realization was understanding that resistance might be impossible once these systems became operational. If religious institutions could directly alter human consciousness through technological means, how could individuals maintain independent thought? If spiritual experience could be artificially controlled, what hope existed for authentic human agency in matters of faith and meaning? The Vatican's consciousness engineering programs represented the ultimate corruption of religious authority. Instead of helping people discover authentic spiritual truth, they were manufacturing artificial experiences designed to serve institutional interests. Instead of fostering genuine relationship with the divine, they were creating technological dependency that eliminated the possibility of independent spiritual development. The decision to leave wasn't just about refusing to participate in corruption or deception. It was about rejecting an institution that had fundamentally betrayed the spiritual trust of humanity. The Vatican was using their moral authority to develop technologies that would eliminate the very consciousness that makes spiritual experience meaningful. But leaving didn't end my exposure to these systems, because they operate through networks that extend far beyond Vatican walls. Avoiding consciousness modification requires constant vigilance. The churches I might visit, the religious media I might consume, the spiritual counseling I might seek, all could potentially expose me to consciousness engineering technologies designed to eliminate independent thought. The evidence I've shared tonight represents the culmination of everything I discovered during my 17 years inside the Vatican. Financial corruption, political manipulation, crisis exploitation, research suppression, all serve the ultimate objective of consciousness engineering for institutional control. The Vatican hasn't been accumulating power, wealth, and influence for centuries just to maintain religious authority. They've been preparing to fundamentally alter human consciousness itself, creating populations that are psychologically incapable of questioning spiritual authority or seeking authentic relationship with the divine. The technological capabilities they've developed exceed anything imagined by secular authorities. The consciousness modification systems they've created could reshape human civilization by eliminating the possibility of independent spiritual thought. The crisis deployment protocols they've prepared would allow implementation during periods when resistance would be impossible. But their success depends on public ignorance of their capabilities and objectives. Once people understand that religious institutions are developing technologies to control consciousness rather than nurture authentic spirituality, resistance becomes possible. Knowledge itself becomes a form of protection against consciousness modification. The choice facing humanity isn't just about religious freedom or separation of church and state. It's about whether consciousness itself will remain the property of individuals or become the domain of institutions claiming divine authority for technological control over human thought and spiritual experience. The Vatican has chosen technological control over authentic spirituality, consciousness engineering over genuine religious guidance, institutional authority over individual spiritual development. They've demonstrated that religious institutions can become the greatest threat to the very spiritual freedom they claim to protect. Tonight marks the end of my testimony about Vatican operations, but it's the beginning of a larger struggle for human consciousness itself. The evidence I've presented provides the foundation for resistance, but that resistance must come from communities committed to protecting the authenticity of spiritual experience against institutional manipulation. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're facing the emergence of technologies that could eliminate human spiritual agency while maintaining the illusion of religious choice. The Vatican has shown that religious institutions can successfully deploy consciousness modification systems while claiming to serve divine purposes. But consciousness belongs to individuals, not institutions. Spiritual experience must remain authentic to retain meaning. Religious authority that depends on technological manipulation rather than genuine wisdom reveals its fundamentally corrupt character. The future of human consciousness hangs in the balance. Religious institutions have chosen manipulation over service, control over guidance, technological tyranny over spiritual freedom. Now humanity must choose whether to accept that future or create alternatives that protect the authenticity of consciousness against institutional engineering. The revolution begins with understanding that consciousness modification is the ultimate violation of human dignity. It continues with resistance to institutions that claim spiritual authority while practicing technological control. It succeeds when consciousness returns to those who possess it rather than those who would engineer it for their own purposes. Tonight, the greatest Vatican secret has been revealed. Tomorrow, the work of protecting human consciousness from institutional control begins. The choice that determines whether future generations experience authentic spirituality or technological manipulation belongs to all of us. But we're making that choice with full knowledge of what religious institutions are capable of when they choose power over service, control over truth, technological manipulation over authentic spiritual guidance. And that knowledge changes everything. Because once you understand consciousness engineering, you can never again mistake artificial spiritual experience for authentic divine encounter. Once you recognize technological manipulation of religious consciousness, you can never again trust institutions that claim divine authority while practicing human control. The Vatican's greatest secret is now fully revealed. The question that remains is whether humanity will choose freedom or allow religious institutions to engineer consciousness according to their institutional vision. The answer to that question will determine the future of human spiritual experience itself. Human consciousness is the final frontier of freedom. The Vatican has chosen to invade that frontier for institutional gain. Now, we must choose whether to defend it for human dignity. The battle for the future of consciousness begins with understanding what we're fighting against. And after tonight, that understanding can never again be taken from us. The question that haunts me most isn't what I discovered during those 17 years inside Vatican walls. It's what I chose to do with that knowledge once I understood its true weight. You see, leaving the Vatican wasn't like quitting any ordinary job. When you've witnessed the mechanisms of institutional power operating at their most sophisticated level, when you've seen how consciousness itself can become a battleground for control, stepping away means entering a world where everything you once trusted suddenly appears suspect. Every news report I read, every social media post I encounter, every seemingly innocent advertisement that crosses my path now carries the potential fingerprints of the influence systems I help maintain, the algorithms that determine what information reaches your eyes, the psychological profiling that shapes your digital experience, the subtle manipulation techniques embedded in everyday communication. I recognize their signatures because I once processed the documents that described their development. But perhaps the most disturbing realization came months after my departure, when I began to understand that my own thoughts and beliefs had been shaped by the very systems I was now trying to expose. How could I trust my motivations for speaking out when those motivations might themselves be the product of consciousness modification protocols designed to identify and neutralize potential dissidents? This paranoia isn't irrational when you understand the sophistication of Vatican's psychological operations. They don't just manipulate external targets. They create comprehensive profiles of everyone within their sphere of influence, including their own personnel. Every priest, every nun, every lay worker becomes both an agent and a subject of institutional consciousness engineering. The Vatican had 17 years to study my psychological patterns, to understand my triggers and vulnerabilities, to map my decision-making processes with clinical precision. When I finally chose to leave, how could I be certain that choice was genuinely mine rather than the predictable outcome of a long-term manipulation strategy? This uncertainty extends to everything I've shared with you tonight. The documents I accessed, the revelations I uncovered, the patterns I identified, all could potentially be part of a more complex operation designed to serve Vatican interests through apparent opposition to their authority. Even whistleblowing can become a tool of institutional control when properly managed. But here's what I learned during the years of psychological deprogramming that followed my departure. Truth doesn't require certainty about motivation to retain its validity. Evidence doesn't become false because the person presenting it might be compromised. Reality doesn't depend on the purity of its witnesses to continue being real. The documents I saw exist regardless of why I was allowed to see them. The systems I describe operate regardless of whether my description serves hidden institutional purposes. The consciousness modification technologies I've revealed function regardless of whether my revelation is part of some larger manipulation strategy. What matters isn't the perfection of my testimony, but the verifiable nature of the claims I'm making. Every assertion I've shared tonight can be investigated independently. Every system I've described leaves traces that can be detected by those who know what to look for. Every manipulation technique I've revealed produces effects that can be measured and documented. The Vatican's greatest weakness isn't their fear of exposure. It's their dependence on systems so complex and far-reaching that they cannot be completely hidden from scrutiny. Consciousness modification technologies require research infrastructure that involves thousands of people. Crisis preparation protocols need coordination with external institutions that keep records. Financial manipulation systems create paper trails that span multiple countries and regulatory frameworks. No institution, regardless of how sophisticated their secrecy systems, can operate on the scale the Vatican has achieved without leaving evidence that independent investigators can discover and verify. My testimony provides a roadmap for that investigation, but the evidence itself exists independently of my credibility or motivations. This is why I've chosen to speak, despite my uncertainty about my own psychological conditioning. The truth I've witnessed is too important to remain hidden because of questions about my personal reliability. If even half of what I've described is accurate, humanity faces a threat to consciousness itself that transcends any concern about my individual trustworthiness. the consciousness modification systems alone represent a fundamental challenge to human freedom that demands immediate attention regardless of who first reveals their existence. If religious institutions can artificially engineer spiritual experience, manipulate belief formation, and eliminate critical thinking through technological means, then the very foundation of human agency is at stake. The crisis preparation protocols I've described pose similar threats to democratic civilization. If religious authorities can exploit disasters to assume governmental functions while implementing mass consciousness modification, then every natural disaster, economic collapse, or social upheaval becomes an opportunity for the elimination of secular authority and individual freedom. The technological influence systems operating through digital platforms represent a clear and present danger to informed democratic participation. If algorithms can be designed to suppress certain ideas while amplifying others, if psychological profiles can be used to target manipulative messaging with surgical precision, then the marketplace of ideas becomes a rigged system serving institutional rather than human interests. These threats exist whether I'm a reliable witness or a sophisticated disinformation agent. They demand investigation whether my motivations are pure or compromised. They require resistance whether my testimony is completely accurate or partially fabricated. But beyond the specific systems I've described lies a more fundamental question about the relationship between institutional authority and individual consciousness. Should any organization, regardless of its claimed divine mandate, possess the technological capability to directly alter human thought and spiritual experience? The Vatican's consciousness engineering programs represent just one example of how religious institutions might use advanced technology to maintain authority in an age of increasing skepticism about traditional spiritual claims. Other religious organizations, political movements, and commercial entities could develop similar capabilities for their own purposes. The precedent being set by Vatican operations extends far beyond Catholic communities to affect the basic principles governing human consciousness in technological societies. If consciousness modification becomes an accepted tool of institutional authority, then the possibility of authentic human experience begins to disappear entirely. This is why the evidence I've presented tonight matters regardless of questions about my personal reliability or hidden institutional agendas. We're facing the emergence of technologies that could fundamentally alter what it means to be human. And those technologies are being developed by institutions that claim moral authority while practicing systematic deception. The choice before humanity isn't just about trusting my testimony or investigating my claims. It's about deciding whether consciousness itself will remain the domain of individuals or become the property of institutions with the technological sophistication to engineer human thought according to their objectives. Religious authorities have demonstrated their willingness to use advanced technology for consciousness, control rather than spiritual service. Political institutions are developing similar capabilities for social management. Commercial organizations deploy psychological manipulation techniques for profit maximization. The convergence of these trends represents an unprecedented threat to human mental freedom. My 17 years inside Vatican walls provided a window into how one powerful institution approaches the challenge of maintaining authority in an age of technological possibility. The specific systems I've described may be unique to the Catholic Church, but the underlying principles could be applied by any organization with sufficient resources and motivation. The question isn't whether every detail of my testimony is completely accurate. The question is whether humanity will allow institutional authorities to develop consciousness modification capabilities without democratic oversight, public accountability, or ethical constraints. The evidence suggests that this development is already well advanced. The technological infrastructure exists. The psychological research has been conducted. The deployment protocols have been tested. The only remaining question is whether public awareness can emerge quickly enough to prevent full implementation. Tonight represents one attempt to generate that awareness. My testimony provides evidence that consciousness modification technologies are not theoretical possibilities, but operational realities. Whether that evidence comes from a reliable whistleblower or a sophisticated disinformation campaign, it points to systems that can be independently verified by those with the resources and motivation to investigate. The Vatican's greatest secret isn't any specific document or hidden operation. It's the simple fact that consciousness itself has become a battleground between institutional control and individual freedom. Religious authorities have chosen control. Now humanity must choose whether to accept that choice or create alternatives that protect mental freedom against technological manipulation. The revolution begins with recognizing that consciousness modification is happening whether we acknowledge it or not. It continues with demanding transparency from institutions that claim moral authority while practicing technological control. It succeeds when human beings refuse to accept artificial manipulation of their most fundamental experiences. My testimony ends here, but the larger struggle for human consciousness has only begun. The evidence I've presented provides a foundation for that struggle, but the outcome depends on collective action by communities committed to protecting mental freedom against institutional engineering. The choice facing our generation will determine whether future humans experience authentic consciousness or accept artificial manipulation as natural authority. The Vatican has shown us what happens when religious institutions choose technology over truth, control over as service, manipulation over genuine spiritual guidance. Now it's time to show them what happens when human beings choose freedom over institutional control, authentic experience over artificial manipulation, genuine consciousness over engineered compliance. The future of human mental freedom depends on our response to what we've learned tonight. The greatest Vatican secret has been revealed. The question that remains is what we'll do with that knowledge. Because in the end, consciousness belongs to those who possess it, not those who would engineer it for their own purposes. And that truth, once understood, can never be taken away by any institution, regardless of how sophisticated their manipulation systems become. The age of consciousness engineering is ending. The age of mental freedom begins now.